Have you seen that Hallmark movie where the arrogant big city New England academic experiences tragedy and has to move back home to find the meaning of life and fall in love? That's what happened to me, minus the meaning of life and the fall in love part. My name is Seth, and in February 2020, my father passed, and a couple of weeks later, the world shut down in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I ultimately decided I preferred my hometown of Memphis to Boston, and I wanted to live closer to my mother. It has been a period of adjustment. One of the main differences between Boston and Memphis is that Boston is a progressive queer space, but a conservative/racist space. There are whole parts of Boston where it's obvious that I was not welcome. I enjoy multiple queer spaces, and specifically cruising, bars, clubs, and parties in Boston. In Memphis, there are a few bars. Most are drag specific. The apps such as Jack'd and Grindr are go-tos, but I prefer to see in-person reactions. Bars like the white and leather themed The Pumping Station or the black and often straight Side Street are hit or miss when it comes to finding other black men. Living above the Mason-Dixon line, it is often easier to find queer spaces with openly queer black men. Specifically, the false dichotomy between supposed black straight spaces and white queer spaces is often validated with the lack of black and queer spaces in many southern cities. One space that complicates these static understandings of space is Martin Luther King Riverside Park in Memphis, Tennessee. I argue that Martin Luther King Riverside Park is the hottest black queer space in Memphis, where I see men and the action every time I go. I see the city of Memphis as a very specific context, a mid-sized black city in the Mid-South Bible Belt, but also representative of larger American homophobic silences around sexuality. Cruising or picking up men in MLK-Riverside exists in a gray area between straight and gay space that allows men to evade the stigma of queer identity tied to space. I am questioning, what role does the racial/sexual history of Memphis play in how we understand space? How do black women and queer people reimagine space to survive racist, homophobic, and transphobic forces? What can MLK-Riverside tell us about issues of space and safety? Full disclosure, I'm not interested in what people are doing sexually in the park. To each their own, do your thing. Just watch out for the police. I'm instead more focused on how the park functions as a space within the larger racial and sexual politics of the city. In my analysis of my park observations, black and queer Memphis histories, and interviews with peers in black queer cultural sexual work, two themes emerged. One, black queer space as unstable, and two, black queer approaches to making space. MLK-Riverside exists both as a traditionally family space and a notorious queer cruising spot. The former everyone knows, while the latter no one knows about until you get caught. To understand the strategies that contemporary black queer people employ to reimagine the park as a space, it is important to understand what black women and queer people have endured to survive in Memphis. This is Unbuckling the Bible Belt, Black Queer Literacies of Cruising in Memphis. Queering Memphis history at MLK-Riverside. Memphis is well known for its barbecue, Beale Street, and blues. It is home to Elvis Presley's Graceland, FedEx, and the Church of God in Christ Holy Convocation, as well as the home of the blues and the birthplace of rock and roll. It is perhaps as well known for white racism, crime, and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Movies like Hustle and Flow and The Blind Side and shows like P-Valley and Greenleaf have brought the church, the grit and grind, as well as the racial and sexual politics of the city to mainstream discourse. In this article, both the site of analysis and the inspiration for one of the foundational theories demonstrate strategies of survival and claiming space in the face of white terrorism. We would not even know about trans pioneer Frances Thompson if she had not claimed space in her congressional testimony in response to the Memphis riots of 1866. There would be no MLK-Riverside Park without Martin Luther King Jr.'s lifetime of activism and his assassination on April 4th, 1968. The narrative of Francis Thompson provides a queer engagement with one of the darkest chapters in Memphis history and is an example of how Black women and queer people have always recreated space for our survival. After the Civil War, many Black people would migrate to Memphis as a part of the Great Migration, while much of the white population would die because of yellow fever. Even though Memphis was far from safe for Black people at this time, the economic opportunities in comparison to the sharecropping and white terrorism of the Deep South were too numerous to be ignored. As a result, Black folks in Memphis have been remaking a hostile space to work for us since the beginning. Many white Memphians resented Black Memphian success and would regularly terrorize Memphis Black citizens. Specifically, the Memphis riot of 1866 demonstrate the great lengths white people went through to try to stop Black progress, as well as the consequences for Memphis Black and queer history. The survivors' testimonies before congressional committees provide examples of how racial rage intersects with larger discourses around sexuality and gender during the Reconstruction period. Hannah Rosen's Not That Sort of Women, Race, Gender, and Sexual Violence during the Memphis riot of 1866 details the discourses and sexual violent lengths white racists took to maintain a chattel slavery-based racist rape culture in Memphis. Rosen analyzed first-hand account of victims. Rosen argues that congressional testimonies of Francis Thompson, her roommate, and the other women who survived sexual violence demonstrate how Black women claimed personhood in a time where the Memphis general public was stupid. Along with slaughtering of Black Memphians, the burning of multiple churches, schools, and homes in South Memphis, the Black section of Memphis at the time, Thompson and others testified to being raped, beat, and robbed by local white men, including members of the Memphis Police Department. Rosen writes that they chose to recount having suffered sexual violence, despite the risks involved, suggests that these testimonies served ends important to them. The public condemnation of protest against these acts as a violation, and the implicit affirmation of their identities as free women with the will to choose or refuse sexual relations and with the right to be protected by law, end quote. Their identities as free Black women, even capable of being victimized, was extremely important to articulate given the circumstances and the realities that these testimonies took place less than a decade after emancipation. Thompson herself was born into slavery and would eventually return to similar conditions due to transphobic laws at the time. When Thompson and the other women testified before Congress, they were taking part of a literate strategy of testifying as citizens, a strategy that was not designed for Black women, but they used to meet their goal. Jacqueline Royster's seminal work, Traces of a Stream, Literacy and Social Change Amongst African American Women, provides insight into how we can understand the impact of these Memphis women's testimonies on how we understand literacy. Royster focuses on elite Black women's use of essay, including Memphis's own anti-lynching activist Ida B. Wells and writer Alice Walker. While the victims of the Memphis riots were deliberately portrayed by the whites against Reconstruction efforts as anything but elite to absolve them of their guilt, the survivors' testimonies are another way that Black women claimed agency and citizenship during Reconstruction. Like Royster, I do not attempt to essentialize how Black queer people create or understand space, but rather I attempt to engage what Royster would call, quote, resonances which become visible through the analytic lens of rhetorical decision-making, end quote. In a similar fashion, Eric Pritchard's article on Solopolis, where he examines the literary practices of Ella Mosley, is a contemporary engagement with the multiple ways trans women make interventions and function with agency to improve their lives and communities. Specifically, Pritchard's notions of literacy normativity and refashioning are at the core of my theorization of how Black queer people use the park. In this context, a normative literacy would be the concept of a straight versus gay space. The idea that these spaces work separate and exclusive to one another work to perpetuate a normative idea of who straight/gay people are and where they be. My dad going off on me when he found out I went to the side street one night is an example of how being in a known queer space can be a violation of Southern respectability politics. My articles on the literary practices of shade and trade, published in Literacy and Composition Studies, provide insight on the various ways, quote, the girls, black women, and queer people have used the literary practice of verbal sparring and pulling trade as practices of community building and survival. My larger argument in these articles is that black queer people often must reimagine and refashion static or normative understandings of literacy in relationship to identity, language, and space to survive. I consider MLK-Riverside to be one of these spaces. The history of MLK-Riverside itself speaks to how spaces are always moving and being reimagined. According to Beverly G. Bond and Janan Sherman's book, Memphis in Black and White, South Memphis's MLK-Riverside Park, then known as Riverside Park, was established as part of the parkway system that also established Overton Park. While there were more plans for Riverside, it was underdeveloped in comparison to Overton. Established in 1872, Riverside Park became a day trip excursion for white Memphians. At the time, black Memphians were barred from all public parks, which led to the South's first black millionaire, Robert Reed Church, to found Church Park, where Mid-South Pride is held every year. By the 1940s and 50s, Memphis grew and began to expand east. White people also began to leave downtown as a part of white flight. During that time, the Valero Oil Refinery, the larger interstate highway system was established, and the beginnings of I-55, which would somewhat isolate the park from the larger city, would be established. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated while working with the sanitation workers in Memphis. Like many other cities across the nation, Memphis government began naming things after the man they despised only months earlier. Riverside Park became Martin Luther King Jr. Riverside Park in 1968. Since then, the park has been home to the Stone Soul Picnic, Greek picnics, family reunions, car shows, birthday parties, smoke sessions, visitations, catfish relays, as well as gay and straight clandestine encounters. To discuss the contemporary queer literacies and cruising politics of MLK-Riverside and Memphis, I've examined a variety of texts that include a collage of literacy narratives of queerness and cruising in the city. Cruising is when particularly men search or occupy a public area in hopes of homosexual activity, often in said spaces. I observed Memphis gay cruising spaces such as bar events, sex parties, pride events, etc. Specifically, I made several trips to MLK-Riverside to cruise and observe men cruising from summer 2020 to summer 2024. I would enter the park usually around 1 or 2 p.m. and stay for a couple of hours. I have to acknowledge that cruising after hours is the popular or ideal time to cruise MLK-Riverside, but again, I don't do parks after dark, and I sure don't do parks in Memphis after dark. I then would drive around the park and park at different spots. I observed what people were doing, vehicles they were driving, and how often they would pass by. I talked to different men, some who were trying to hook up with me, and others while they were cruising. I filmed the park from various locations, as well as litter and trash left behind by the men cruising the area. I have also interviewed sexual health experts about how black queer people recreate sexual spaces. Cruising or cruising for trade is a literary practice or a form of what Jonathan Alexander would call a sexual literacy among queer people that takes place any and everywhere. To riff off of Jose Munoz in his book Cruising Utopias, my investigation into cruising is attentive to the past and attempts to, quote, stave off failures of imagination that I understand as anti-relationality and anti-utopianism in queer critique, end quote. In this way, I'm thinking about how queer people often exist in homophobic spaces, or spaces you wouldn't expect. For example, even homophobic efforts to exclude queer people out of spaces, such as church and fraternity, have inadvertently created queer pockets within what we presume to be straight spaces. Black queer people know that the heteronormative understanding of spaces as simply straight or gay does not effectively speak to our experiences in the culture. Cruising as a literacy queers heteronormative understandings of space in two ways. One, because I, as a queer person, am there, the space is not 100% straight. Two, if I pull a guy from the space, it is certainly not 100% straight and thus queer by heteronormative logic. I'm inspired by books like George Chauncey's Gay New York, Jose Munoz' Cruisin Utopias, Samuel Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, and E. Patrick Johnson's Sweet Tea, Black Gay Men of the South. I also look to documentary films like Gay Sex in the 70s and Fall of 55, as well as narrative films like the Al Pacino film Cruising and Noah's Ark Jumping the Broom, because they illustrate firsthand accounts of gay cruising in parks as well-known and a discussed queer cultural practice. Specifically, I have questions about how Black queer people make/understand space, especially in conversation with larger forces that work against our freedom and survival. Works like Marlon Bailey's Butch Queen Up in Pumps and Jeffrey McCune's Sexual Discretion discuss the various ways Black queer people recreate spaces, like the Detroit queer ballroom scene or Chicago's Black gay clubs, for their own purposes. In Sexual Discretion, McCune discusses gender and sexual performance in Chicago Black queer nightclubs. Specifically, he discusses his experience at a club where, due to the ways hip-hop masculine clothing, gender performance, and music constructed the space, DL men were able to preserve heterosexual or macho identity while engaging in cruising or queer activity. In Chris Bell's article, Not the Man I Used to Be, Bell uses his experiences cruising at academic conferences, often in countries where the locals didn't speak English, to illustrate how the ways we have been taught to practice sexual health and HIV disclosure are not considering the space and context of many clandestine queer encounters. These works encourage me to remember that space does not automatically signify identity. Specifically, the act of cruising renders all spaces and people potentially queer. This is important to remember in a space like MLK-Riverside, located in Kojic, Memphis. The park, as a form of public recreation, is coded as straight, and most of the guys could pass for straight. However, if the trees could talk, they would tell a more complex story. To construct a collective literacy narrative around Black queer people in space, I'm using a mixture of ethnographic methods. When I started this project, I understood that I was examining something that was taboo in the Bible Belt. For this reason, my methods are not as linear as my previous engagements with fierce literacies. In my previous studies of shade and trade, I interviewed gay pride participants because they were out and would likely know how these literate practices function. In this project, I'm essentially studying the literacy of cruising and examining space. I'm thinking through the role that this park plays in the context of a larger city where queer sexual practices are frowned upon. I'm using my observations and experience in the park as the core text. I was not concerned with trying to capture actual hookups or trying to get interviews with the men that were out there. In my opinion, the fact that men hook up in parks and why has been well discussed. Instead, I'm critically engaging with my firsthand observations in conversation with other out Black queer men. While I only interviewed cisgender Black gay men, this was not intentional, but rather a convenient sample. In Memphis, most queer spaces I navigate have a lot of mostly white and lesbian and trans people. If it was not for the Black lesbian DJs playing in queer tolerant spaces, I would not have any place to dance. In my full-length documentary, I will critically engage with more lesbian and trans perspectives. Also, there are several parks in Memphis, including Overton, John F. Kennedy, Shelby Farms, and the Greenway where cruising takes place. However, MLK-Riverside is the only park where every time I visited, I saw black men hooking up. Each of these interviews included about 10 questions and lasted about 1 hour. The participants are all individuals who self-identify as gay and use their expertise in queer culture in their profession. Each of these interviews included about 10 questions and lasted about 1 hour. The participants are all individuals that self-identify as gay and use their expertise in queer culture in their professions. Participants included Memphis Strokes, a queer adult content creator, Michael Riley, Director of Gender and Sexuality Center for Queer and Trans Life at University of Minnesota, Andre Fields, PAC Director of voting rights organization Fair Right and former campaign special assistant to Stacey Abrams, and Josh Hall, Director of Youth and Emergency Services for Out Memphis. Memphis Strokes originally messaged me via Jacked. Rather than hooking up, I asked him to participate in my research and he agreed. I know Michael Riley from when we were both students in Syracuse's Women Gender Studies program. Andre is a fraternity brother of mine. I met Josh at Out Memphis's Queer Prom in 2024. I discussed the project with each participant and sent them the questions before the interviews. Lastly, I am consulting alternative histories, such as Memphis in Black and White and Rise Up, Stonewall, and the LGBTQ rights movement exhibit at the Museum of Science and History. In my analysis, two things emerged: Black queer space as unstable and Black queer approaches to remaking space. While my observations are at the core of my analysis, my interviews, the Rise Up exhibit, and engaging with Memphis history provides a larger cultural context to understand the themes. Black queer space as unstable. Black queer people do not have the privilege to only understand history, literacy, or space as fixed. While New York's Stonewall Inn, Chicago's Boys Town, and even Memphis's Cooper Young District have become official queer spaces enshrined in history, Black queer spaces are often in flux. For example, Memphis's Illusions, the first gay club I ever went to in 2006, was gone after a couple of years. Nashville's Play, where I was first introduced to a gay community, is still there. However, Club 901, where I hung out when I was home from grad school around 2010, was closed a couple years after I attended. Countless Memphis gay bars have existed in the past, such as the Flamingo Room, George's Theater, and the Apartment Club, and are now chronicled in the Rise Up exhibit as proof we were here in Memphis. We lived. However, to understand a space's worth and its permanence can obscure its value. Club 901 may have been temporary, but it's where my good Judy and I did Delta strolls and got our lives. The fickle nature of nightlife also contributes to the transient nature of all establishments, regardless of race and sexual orientation. When I argue that Black queer space is unstable, I'm saying this due to the intersection of racist and homophobic forces Black queer spaces encounter in comparison to white spaces. However, just because Black queer spaces are often unstable in relationship to material spaces, like buildings, it does not mean they do not exist. It only takes meeting one person to make a spot the spot. Specifically, questions of where the men are at the core of my analysis of the unstable nature of Black queer space in Memphis. The question of where do I go tonight to find men is complicated in Memphis. However, thanks to the internet, it is not nearly as complicated as it has been. For the record, gay sex was illegal in Memphis until 1996. And can you imagine having to call the National Organization of Women's Gay Switchboard to find a bar or mental health services? Nowadays, it is easy to find gay establishments like the Pumping Station, Atomic Rose, and Drew's Place in Memphis. However, the music, decorations, atmosphere, and themed events are still geared predominantly towards white people with very few Black people in the space. Also, a lot of insecure Black men are turned off by spaces like Atomic Rose and Drew's because they signify as gay due to them being centered around drag culture. On a good night, you can find us in there making the best of it. But at the same time, this is why MLK-Riverside is so special. When I first moved back to Memphis, I made the rounds to the clubs and bars and ultimately found that I ran into more black queer men at church than at the bar. Memphis' first Gay Day in the Park was held June 27, 1976, and would evolve into what is now Mid-South Pride. I regularly attend Mid-South Pride festivals and queer events, assuming that there will not be many of us there. Mid-South Pride festivals resemble most cities' festivals, with a parade down one of the main streets and culminating festival with a weekend of parties and workshops. The Mid-South Pride Festival marches down the world-famous Beale Street and culminates in Robert Church Park. The Tri-State Black Pride Week of events focuses on black queers, but men are in the minority at their events too. I found out about MLK-Riverside by searching on the internet. I went to cruisingays.com where there was a write-up, and there were also several people on Twitter talking about meeting up at the park. For several men that meet up at MLK-Riverside, the park is a meeting place for people who cannot bring their sexual partners home due to their living situation. Another space that works similarly is the underground sex party scene. Every month or so, a promoter will rent an Airbnb and charge $20 a head for a plastic bag to store your stuff and access to rooms of men having sex. With the darkness of the room and masks being permitted, discreet men can walk in, handle their business, and leave without anyone knowing they were there. Plenty of these men are married, have roommates, or are in the closet. So the park and underground sex parties provide a discreet cover to engage in queer sexual practices. While there are openly gay men that prefer the beauty of an anonymous fuck in the woods, the park is often seen as a trade or DL thing. In my conversations with other out gay men, there's often a stigma around the type of gay men or those gays who frequent parks. During my observations, I would often check myself making assumptions about who would be in the park cruising. One of my first revelations was noticing that I saw custom license plates of every D9 fraternity and every branch of the services. Unlike the bar scene, I read most of the men in the park as trade or straight presenting. Bathhouses serve the same purposes as parks. While bathhouses are known to close spontaneously too, rest in peace to San Francisco's Blow Buddies, they are a legal alternative for those who also do not like mosquito bites. As one of the interviewees say in Gay Sex in the 70s, bathhouses are the only place you are guaranteed to get something. When I asked Michael where to go in Chicago to get some action, the answer was not complicated. He referred me to North Halsted, the gayborhood, and specifically to Steamworks. Steamworks with its saunas, jacuzzis, glory holes, multiple levels for cruising, and room custom made for fellatio is the best bathhouse I've seen. To examine Memphis' queer scene is to examine it in relationship with surrounding queer cities. When I was growing up in Memphis in the early 2000s, and when I was attending Tennessee State University in Nashville, Atlanta was going through its post-Olympic / entertainment industry boom. With shows like Real Housewives of Atlanta, the city's reputation as a gay mecca was solidified in mainstream culture. Now, if there was ever a location where I do not have to ask anyone where the brothers are, it's Atlanta. Like Chicago, Atlanta is the place where many gays in and out of the closet go to quote unquote live their lives. In the city, black queer people have co-opted Martin Luther King Jr. holiday weekend into an unofficial Pride weekend with a host of parties and events. When I interviewed adult content creator Memphis Strokes, he was freshly back from MLK weekend, where he was able to collaborate with other content creators and participate in some of the sex parties.
Okay, so this past weekend is like a mini Pride for Atlanta. Why MLK weekend? Who knows? So I went to Atlanta for MLK weekend, and people come from all around the city and just enjoy being gay.
Now, what does that mean? What does that consist of? You know, because I feel like I'm being gay sitting on this chair, but like, what do you mean?
So here's the difference. Some of us are from cities or towns or locations that are not as gay friendly as Atlanta is. So even though we may be as gay as we want to be inside of our homes, we can't go to the mall and let it all hang out.
Mm-hmm.
We can't go, hang out in the park and let it be, because we feel we have to be respectful of people that are there as well. But in Atlanta, it's an all-inclusive type place. So you can go to the Mexican restaurant up the street and have on a blonde wig, and they gonna speak to you and say, "Hey, girl," and that's why people flock to Atlanta, and I love it.
He goes on to discuss how when he goes to Atlanta, he can feel a certain level of freedom that he does not feel in Memphis in relationship to sexuality and gender performance. He used the blonde wig, which often is seen as the epitome of femininity, as a symbol or metaphor for what would be considered extreme and or frowned upon gender performance in Memphis. I can co-sign similar feelings in my experience in Atlanta the following year when I interviewed Andre. Andre had a list of bars for me to check out in Atlanta. Hell, I didn't even finish my drink in the karaoke bar he recommended before I had made a friend.
So I'm gonna ask you before the end of the night where I need to go tonight, tomorrow, and the next day.
What's tonight? Thursday?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, go to G's.
G's?
Yeah,
Okay.
G's in Midtown.
So just walk through.
Mm-hmm. G's. Oh, Bulldogs is popping tonight too, and Bulldogs is like
So I'm gonna get what I need at Bulldogs.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Bulldogs is like it's one of the oldest gay establishments in Atlanta. It's a historic landmark.
So I'm gonna find me a 6-foot dude with a 10-inch dick.
Maybe, I don't know.
Andre also reminds us that even in Atlanta, black gay spaces are disappearing.
But I think there are starting to be like a lot of destruction of some of these queer spaces, right? And that's not okay. There are still,
due to the pandemic or just in general?
I think just in general, right? Like Bulldogs is still here; it's a staple. We have G's, 10th and Piedmont, Blake's. Usually the white gays love Blake's, but we go there sometimes if we want to have a little drink. You have Midtown Moon. We have the amazing drag shows. I'm trying to think of the other spaces. Oh, you have the Marquette, which is the girls be acting up in there, but it's still one of our spaces, right?
You ain't with the acting up now.
I'm not.
Cooper Young is considered the gay or progressive neighborhood in Memphis with its shops, bars, and eateries. It is where a Rainbow Walk is and has been recognized for its high population of queer residents. One Memphis spot that came up in interviews was Side Street. My earliest memory of Side Street was going there with a friend of mine and casually telling my dad afterwards. My dad went off on me for going to, quote, such a place and said that it had even burned down, which had nothing to do with anything. It seems like a regular black martini bar to me at the time. However, I understood it was gay adjacent. Both Memphis Strokes and Josh discussed Side Street as a gay but basically straight bar.
When's the last time you had brunch on a Sunday in a restaurant in Memphis, and when you walked in, it was full of gay and gay-friendly people, and you felt at home when you walked in? When's the last time you had that in Memphis?
Even before COVID. No, I get what you mean.
Even
you can find a restaurant, like a soul food restaurant, where families are after church, but you're not going to find no.
Let me just tell you this. Mm-hmm. First and foremost, even during COVID, Atlanta is still like that.
I believe that.
Secondly, Memphis had, so let's take Side Street. I'm sure you've heard of Side Street.
Mm-hmm.
Side Street was a very gay-friendly restaurant.
Right.
That gays hung out at. And it was known to be a gay-friendly bar. Mm-hmm. The past few times I've been there were more straight people there than there were gay.
I'll say that.
And it took away that comfortability. It took away that I'm with my people. It takes that away, and people don't understand that.
Now, what about the area? How do you feel about the Cooper Young area? Do you feel like that's gay friendly or what?
It is for the white man.
I hear that too. There's a difference.
There's a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I would also say that there's a difference between a simply liberal space and a gay-friendly space, and then there's a difference between a gay-friendly space and a space that is friendly to Black gay people.
Agree.
You know?
Agree.
And I would argue that all that is just liberal space. But go ahead.
And I can tell you are like me. We are, neither of us are those people that are racially biased. Like, I don't have to be around Black people. I don't have to be around white people. I can be around Hispanics and they will love the dick. Okay. But
that still exists, and aren't we around the corner from, Side Street by the Playhouse? Okay, let me rewind.
I know Side Street Grill, but not.
Yeah, because that's queer adjacent, right? Or
Honestly, I don't know. I kind of assume everything. If it's over here, I assume it's queer.
You actually bring up an excellent point, because me and Lamarcus, Memphis Strokes, whatever, we're talking about Side Street, and he was like, "Yeah, it's supposed to be gay, but every time I go up in there, I don't see gay people in there." So it's like, and, me and him co-signed on that. I'm like, Now, when I mentioned this to my students, because they asked me about the project that I was working on, one of my students was like, "I was just up in there," and I was like, "Well, and she was like, "Well, I was on a gay date." I'm like, "Well."
All right.
So let me say I haven't been to Side Street in a couple of years since post-COVID, actually, So all I know is I went one time, I want to say in 2008, and it was packed up in there, so.
Yeah.
But you get at another thing, though, is one of my theories about the South, below the Mason-Dixon, not necessarily Atlanta, of course, but everywhere else, is gay means white, Black means straight. So, now, on a good night at Side Street, I think you're going to get a good mix. But to me, when I'm at Drew's, when I'm at Atomic Rose,
We ain't in there.
we're not in there, we're not on the walls, and they're barely playing our music. They're playing
Which is kind of, I want to. You mentioned the percentage earlier, which I think about all the time. Like, we're a majority Black city.
Majority Black city.
So you would assume if you're majority Black, then there's a majority Black queers out here too. So yeah, where are we represented? Where are we in the clubs? Where is a safe space for us? Because like here, and we have our youth center down the street. Those are the things that's in my head. Like somebody walks into the center who don't know anything about me. They might see a Black face or might see a Latinx face, but those, I'm thinking about, what does this space look like? Are we on the walls? Like, is there positive representation of Black? But yeah, that's a good point. Like, I feel like me as a gay man, like my space, like my home, I take a lot of pride in I live in a little shoebox apartment. I love my little apartment, my 2 cats, and we vibe out.
Because that's part of it too. Like, I was at an academic conference where one professor was talking about that she designed her office on campus in a way that emanated Blackness, was a cocoon of Blackness, because that's essentially what she needs. And that we need these spaces, and that truly the home space in your hometown is the most important space.
Where it starts, at least.
Or at least where it starts. Yeah.
But then, like you said, to have that avenue into culture, what is the gay culture? When I do want to step out of just my safe space, my home that I do it for myself.
And you work in gay culture too, so that may be another reason why,
Right. Yes. In the same way I kind of had, when I was teaching, I kind of had, certain avenues. I used to smoke cigarettes back then. I wouldn't want to be seen smoking a cigarette by a student. Yeah, kind of the same thing. I work in a queer space. I work in service to the queer community. And so it does kind of curtail, the avenues that I do and don't explore. Yeah. I'd say that. I'd say that's a true statement.
My student saying that she thought of Side Street as a gay bar, and the last time she was there, she was on a gay date, also speaks to the unstable nature of queer space. Spaces can be created for straight purposes and be refashioned to satisfy queer people's needs. Also, just because a space is created for and by queer people does not mean that they always function for queer people's needs or that they're safe. I asked Josh what his spaces were in Memphis, and he responded home. While I do believe he was being a bit facetious, I think his answer gets at a couple of things that many Black queer people in their 30s can relate to, like aging and finding nightlife less interesting, being unsatisfied with Memphis queer nightlife, and the emergence of queer dating apps as spaces within themselves. While official spaces made for and by Black queer people are often unstable, Black queer people also regularly remake existing spaces for queer purposes. Queer approaches to reimagining space. Another way to think about queer people's relationship with space is that we are also always remaking space to make it do what we need it to do. MLK-Riverside was founded with the intent that Black people would never use it. It certainly was not founded, nor is it currently promoted by the city as a Black gay hotspot. However, all one must do is look at the news or arrest records to know what it is. Men often either go to the park and use social media apps to find other men in the park, or they meet on the apps and then meet up in person at the park. Some men just go to the park, drive, and walk around looking. Chris, a guy I used to date, told me he got caught at MLK-Riverside. According to him, he met a white guy on the apps and decided to meet up with him at the park that night. I'm not sure where in the park they were, but the cops pulled up on them. While Chris tried to pretend that they were just talking, the guy he was hooking up with told the truth. They both got arrested. After 3 years of observation, I've caught multiple people in the act, and several men have pulled out their dicks to woo me into sex. One man named Michael pulled up in his four-wheeler while I was walking down the road that leads to the main hookup spot in the park. I told him that I was studying the park and cruisin culture. After showing me the location, he pulled out his dick and asked if I wanted to do something. I refused, and he responded, "Oh, so you're out here to study for real?" I said, "Yes, I am." For me, the park feels unsafe. The threat of police arrest, robbery, murder, and mosquito bites takes me out of it. Not to mention, I likely have not fully unlearned being judgmental of quote-unquote those gays. However, some of these risks are what make the park exciting and sexy for many men. Specifically, questions of what is safe are at the core of my analysis of Black queer people reimagining space in Memphis. The men who meet up at the park reimagine it as a hookup spot. They reclaim the public space as theirs. The building of I-55 and the Valero oil processing plant also play a role by partially secluding the park for the larger Memphis area. Within the park, when things shift, people shift around them as well. In 2023, there was a storm that knocked a big tree down and blocked the road in front of the hookup spot. The first time I saw it, I just hopped over it. After I got over the log, I thought to myself that people will not hop over the log to get to the spot. A couple weeks later, I logged onto Twitter and saw videos of gays having sex in front of the log itself as a part of their OnlyFans content. Not only had the log become a prop, but the park was remade into an OnlyFans studio. Another new development are the white blocks that were placed in the parking lots. I do not know if this was to cut down on cruising or car flicking, but it's interesting nonetheless. Of all the evidence that demonstrates to me how MLK-Riverside functions as a space, it is the litter that sticks out the most. Litter stands in as an archive of who has been there and what they were doing. Every day I did observations at the park, I found used condoms, lube, cigar wrappers, water and liquor bottles, baby wipes, and underwear. What stuck out the most were the used condoms, condom wrappers, lube, and baby wipes because it's undeniable how they were used. While these items can be found at any and every park, as well as any location at MLK-Riverside, what is interesting is that they were concentrated at a few locations at the end of the road where the seats are, i.e. the hookup spot. Police would have to drive into the park itself to access this road, rather than the periphery to catch one partaking. The benches close to the end of the road and the pathway that Michael showed me are not visible to the average passerby, so they are somewhat, quote unquote, safe cruising areas. Little Richard's famous original lyrics to Tutti Frutti come to mind. Tutti Frutti, good booty. If it don't fit, don't force it. If you grease it, you make it easy. While no litter does not inherently mean sex is not happening, used condoms are not only proofs of sex, but to a certain extent, sex education. My initial reaction was, someone is teaching someone about something out here. To me, this is a positive sign because the litter proves at least someone understands the materials needed to have enjoyable anal sex and that some people are protecting themselves. In his work at Out Memphis, Josh regularly thinks about how to reach young Memphis people who frequent apps and cruising spaces like MLK-Riverside. He goes on to talk about some of the sexual health and trans advocacy work they do at Out Memphis.
And so coming back to the Tennessee legislation, there's Memphis, which is oftentimes seen as blue, or not just seen as blue, is blue, but it's inside of a larger red state.
Yeah.
So I think that red, and when we're talking about Bible Belt, I'm typically talking about Black Bible Belt, to be literal. But there's a larger Bible Belt around the Black Bible Belt that is really at the heart of this ban. You know, this kind of, and I hate to say it like this, kind of white, right-wing, evangelical push. So can you tell me anything about that, or how are y'all dealing with that? What's the morale? What now?
Ooh, girl, child.
Do we all just chill today and start back tomorrow? You know.
Now, let me start with the tiniest shred of optimism in all this is that we have kind of been told and like assured by our like local DA and like our officers that it's not enforceable and that they won't be enforced here in Shelby County, but you know, again, words. For us, morale is kind of all over the place. We kind of see it for what it is, and this is an attack at trans people. Like they're saying, oh, it's drag, you know, and it's this, but you know, we all know what drag is, and we as queer people and just a normal person listening that's not on the rock.
Governor Bill Lee knows what drag is because he's done drag.
Right. So we see that for what it is, and like, you know, we know that that's actually the core where they're trying to strike. They're trying to like exclude trans people from conversations, exclude trans people from rights, and this being a way to do that. If a trans person is out in public and a person can say, well, this person is in drag and they're in front of kids, like that's how we interpret and, you know, what this law is actually trying to do and what these bans are actually trying to do. And so that's how our response is, you know, we're more so focusing on that part of it more so than just, you know, the drag and like what can our services do to lift trans folks, to make sure that trans folks have the education around what the actual meanings of these bans were, the access to get to where they need to continue living the lives that they deserve to live as an American citizen in this country. So yeah, that's where our focus is, you know, I guess as an organization, and the advocacy side of it, like more so on like the rights, like what could this ban, what could the precedent for this kind of ban, you know, mean for years to come, you know. But yeah, we kind of see it as like a very poorly veiled attempt at removing trans rights, and we're reacting accordingly.
I'm also thinking about potentially hostile spaces such as church and fraternity, which have historically been homophobic. These have also served as spaces of queer sexual awakening and kinship. For example, I know many Black gay men whose first queer experiences took place in the church. Michael points to experiences growing up in the church that would inform his reading of the world as a queer man.
There's at least of like the dozen or so young people who are making up the youth ministry. One is trans. At least 3 of us are like out, like, you know, with partners, like out with like, you know, on Facebook, like, you know, at Pride.
Like out. And that's why, and if we can pause real quick, yes, outness is complicated. Yes, outness is different for everyone.
And also sometimes it's not.
Because I got to make this announcement for the listeners.
Okay.
But we not gonna all sit up in here and act like we don't know what out is.
Absolutely, we definitely
And that's what you're getting at there. Not that out is a nose ring, not that out is pride, but out is out.
But out is out, and those things are there, and like face stamped, like lip gloss on. There's too many of. So the reason why I think it's important to point to church, there's just so many of them there. Enough that my mom and I, like, when we fight about queer shit, still she's like, it's because they're like. She's like, the reason why there's so many gay, y'all, there was a demon, there's a spirit that got, and I'm like, all of us? I'm like, all of us. That many? Because that is a busy spirit, man. Like, that is busy. Like,
and I'm gonna tell you the truth. The reason the spirit, because one, me and you both grew up in church. What denomination?
I'm Kojic.
Okay, you Kojic, I'm Baptist. Now, but keep in mind, I'm from Memphis. And
So
Memphis
that's different.
Thank you. So keep in mind, we kind of Kojic.
I would consider.
Thank you. So that's Memphis. But what I love about this queering of how we understand space. Now, we haven't necessarily cleared space as in how we understand city or whatever.
Right.
But what I love is that we were talking about Chicago. But Chicago, even though it's where you live, it's where you enjoy, is somewhat irrelevant to this conversation.
A little bit.
A
little bit.
Minnesota and the church are a little bit more relevant.
Absolutely.
And what I would say, to your theorization of sexuality.
Absolutely. I learned so much about my sexuality super early on about in the church.
I've had similar experiences to Michael in the church as well as fraternity, where seemingly a lot of people were queer, but few people were out of the closet. As a black gay man who is a member of Alpha Pi Alpha fraternity, which is historically conservative but homophobic, I'm in a community with other queer men inside the fraternity. In many ways, it is our own underground fraternity or sorority. Specifically, Andre discussed how queer Alpha Brothers created a space within the organization for him to learn as a queer man.
It wasn't more so the sexual piece, but more so the brotherhood and really, because at this time I'm really trying to understand what it means to be a queer man, right? And I have no sort of blueprint, right, other than what I'm seeing on TV or what I'm reading, right? But I didn't have that sort of I didn't have that human experience of another person who sort of had I met brothers who had been out since maybe their teenage years, right, or some who had come out a little bit earlier than me, right? And I think sort of having conversations with them and sort of learning and bouncing, ideas and whatnot off of folk really helped in some of my growth. And I think these also planted the seeds for some really long-lasting friendships.
I feel alphas have been the least progressive gay men that I've met.
No. I'm talking about the queer alpha men that I've like.
There's a difference. Yeah. There's a difference between alphas that or fraternity brothers that engage in gay sex or sexuality versus meeting another out gay or queer alpha. I feel that most out gay alphas I find myself loving and thinking that they're cool as hell. And down low ones.
Right. And I think my experience most has been with the brothers and most of us started in that same space, right, where we were trying to figure it out. And I think together we sort of we've grown, right? Because I think back to some of my really closest friends now, right? And I'm thinking back to 2010, we're in Las Vegas in convention and we're trying to
I remember that.
We're trying to sneak around, right? To basically find out where the girls at, right? Where can we go let our hair
Where
down,
were they
right?
not?
No.
At that convention in particular.
I'm saying but also still protect.
I know what you mean.
Right? Because
But I want to push back against that protect. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, because we were not comfortable yet, right?
Okay.
Like being like fully who we were. This is like, this is still early stages, but by the time, let's say, we get to like Eastern Regional Convention and like Buffalo a couple years later, right? The girls just like, oh, hi.
Andre's narrative provides a progressive narrative of queerness and fraternity life. Divine non-fraternities and sororities have been hostile to queer folks forever. Look at the steps, strolls, chants, etc. Recently, Alpha Phi Alpha and Phi Beta Sigma have received criticism for their effort to define male towards the exclusion of trans members. These organizations are waning in relevance, just to keep it real. Trans brothers would be the salvation. However, transphobia is not just specific to church and fraternity. The narrative of Frances Thompson ends tragically. 10 years after Thompson testified before Congress, she was arrested for impersonating a woman and was forced to serve on the chain gang. This was a sight for Memphis as they clamored to see Thompson in men's clothes serving on the gang. Racist white Memphians used her transness to suggest that she and the other women were lying about what happened to them and used the situation to protest Reconstruction efforts. Even though Thompson would get sick and die in a cabin in North Memphis, white Memphians' efforts to invalidate Thompson would only solidify her as one of the first trans people on record in the South. The house she shared with her roommate, as well as the testimonies of the survivors, also demonstrate cisgender and transgender solidarity dating back to the 1800s. When I graduated from high school in 2006, I remember leaving Memphis saying that I basically wanted to live anywhere other than Memphis. I basically had been taught the idea through my parents, through my experience in Memphis, and through the media that Memphis, Tennessee had nothing for me. Specifically as a queer person, as a black queer person, I couldn't wait to get to the New Yorks, to get to the DCs, to get to the Atlantas. Current Mayor Paul Young recently came to Lemoyne-Owen and spoke at Honors Convocation. In his speech, he told the students, New York doesn't need you. Atlanta doesn't need you. DC doesn't need you. Memphis needs you. Stay. And one of the things that he was referring to was brain drain. This idea that people go to cities to get educated. Like they attend University of Memphis, Rose, Lemoyne-Owen, Christian Brothers, but they ultimately leave because there's nothing for them in said cities and drain the city of its intellectual worth. And this not just happens intellectually, as in academically, but this also happens as in culturally in the worlds that we create. That us as queer people are oftentimes led to believe that we shouldn't be in the South, that we should not live in red states, that we need to leave home in order to be free, in order to be ourselves. And specifically in this political climate, I think it's important to decenter the idea that queer people only exist in urban metropolitan spaces. Shows like P-Valley and Greenleaf do a great job at taking us into day-to-day lives of Black queer people who live in the South. Specifically, queer people that live in Memphis and surrounding areas. So with that being said, I feel like the importance of this work is that I'm bringing or putting a spotlight on Black queer people that exist in the South, that exist in rural places, that exist in cities that are not as big, and essentially showing that we have always been here. We are here now, and we will be here. And that essentially what we have always done, the ways in which Black women and Black queer people have created and recreated space, are the mandates that we need in order both to survive the current white supremacist society that we live in now, in order to survive, if things get more conservative, we've just lived through a Donald Trump presidency. A 1920s Germany was far more liberal than a 1930s Germany. So things can go back. Things can switch on a dime. But we also need to be concerned about when this society is over, when America and or capitalism is no more, what type of societies do we want to create? What do we need them to look like? What do we need them to do? How is everyone being taken care of? And with that being said, it is my belief that Black women, Black queer people are the people to look at. People like Frances Thompson and people like the women in her life that shared space with her, that both created space for each other to live and survive, but also how these women came together and testified even in the face of larger white supremacist forces that suggested that they were not human. So with that being said, I bid you all adieu, and this has been Unbuckling the Bible Belt.